of rest called the collective care. Loving God, we confess that we are so accustomed to pushing through an exhausted state that we come to expect the same from those nearest to us. We mirror the demands made of us and disassociate from the reality that these demands have harmed us, have left us anxious and unwell. Reorient our souls toward more than self-care. We want more for one another than the same expectations that haunt us, the same brutal experience of living within the systems of this world. Free us from resentment and envy as we bear witness to the prophets in our lives who practice rest and boundaries well. Let them be our guides into deeper freedom. Help us to never get used to being used. We were made for more, and together we possess the mysterious power of regeneration wrapped up in our bones. May it be so. For any of you that have done some mindfulness practices, we're just going to do some time of just breathing in and breathing out of some different phrases for you to think about. The first one is, as we inhale, I deserve more than exhaustion. And as we exhale, I return home to myself. As we inhale, may I rest. And as we exhale, that I might dream. And as we inhale, I've given enough. And as we exhale, I choose rest. And hear this prayer of forgiveness. Let your soul receive this rest. The God who sends the sun to sleep each night without apology, so too grants you the rest that has been withheld from you and your ancestors. She forgives us all our restlessness, that we would no longer be tormented by silence and stillness, but find it a sacred reprieve from a world whose demand on our bodies is loud and unceasing. Amen. So Kristen is handing out to everyone a colored pencil and a piece of paper. Some of you may have heard of author Elizabeth Gilbert. She's written Eat, Pray, Love, Big Magic, and other things. One of the newest journeys she's doing is called Letters from Love. And while these are being handed out, I'm going to read to you what this is about. Letters from Love is both a learning space and a spiritual practice. Here people come together to discover their inherent value and exquisite preciousness, and to learn how to write and speak to themselves from a place of love and friendliness. Self-loathing is a rampant virus in our contemporary culture, so prevalent as to have become the default setting in most of our minds. Seldom do we even stop to question whether it is normal or healthy to live within a consciousness that is constantly attacking, judging, and insulting itself. But to condemn yourself as unlovable is to swallow a terrible lie. And to believe that you must earn love through perfectionism, or that you must seek love from others in order to become whole, turns all of us into hungry beggars. She believes there's an ocean of warm, affectionate, and outrageously unconditional love available to us all. And that it is conveniently accessible from within. She believes that anyone is excluded from the ocean of love. It is only a question of learning how to hear it. how to feel it, how to trust it. So while each of you are taking time to write a letter of love to yourself, it can be as long or short as you want, I'm just going to pause here and read some of them from people she's interviewed and read some of those over you. So just take the next 10 or so minutes to just write a letter of love to yourself for where you are right now, for your space. Dear love, oh sweet little girl. Yes, I said little girl. You have spent much of your life trying to figure yourself out, trying to understand yourself and how you fit into the world. Your questions about why you're here and what this is all about are good. These questions keep you alive and awake. Sometimes though, honey, they can take you out and make life unmanageable. Know that I see you. Know that you are good. Also know that good and bad are bullshit. Know that your goodness isn't something I need to see you. Know that I love looking at you and watching you and seeing you explore. Because isn't that what you love to do most? Isn't seeing things and doing things and experiencing things the stuff that makes you feel the most? And isn't feeling the best? Let me get back to the questions, honey. The questions will keep coming and coming and coming. Don't be so concerned with finding the answers. That's where you can get stuck. Life isn't about the answers. It's about living out the questions. You have worked really, really hard trying to understand yourself in the world, and sometimes it's exhausting. You also have this little worry deep down, and that kind of work you've done and become expert at excludes you from other work, or asking other questions of yourself and the world. You did go down a long, arduous road. It was very focused. You did that for certain reasons that you still are uncovering and reaping the benefit and recovering from. But that does not limit you to just that one thing. Sweetie, you have always known you are more than just soccer. And now that you are truly stepping into pureness of love and self-expression, you will keep discovering that. You are discovering that nothing is by chance, and everything that happened to you was on purpose. The addictions, the heartache, all of it was necessary. But even during all that tumult, I was there. I was with you. And I know you heard me. My feelings aren't hurt that you needed to ignore me for so long. And I can't understand how hard it is to believe that I was there then, as I am now. Can you trust that I exist and that I've been there with you from the beginning? I love you, and you are loved, baby girl. But it's not about me, it's about you and what you want to do. And if you want to believe, as I always have, that love doesn't just live outside of you, it's everywhere. I am in everything. I am in everyone. I am in you. And I understand how hard life can be. We can do hard things, right? You know that the ego loves nothing more than to think about itself and to talk about itself and then to to punish you and shame you for thinking about yourself so much and talking about yourself so much, and then to set up new morality rules about how you're not allowed to think about yourself and talk about yourself anymore, and then to judge you for failing at those rules. And while it's at it, your ego loves to judge and measure how much time others are spending talking and thinking about themselves. Oh, what a house of mirrors. What a tangle of fake news, drama, misunderstanding. But do you think I will scorn your ego? Do you think I will tell you to get rid of your ego? My child, have you met me? Does that even sound like me? Scorn, rules, expulsion, shame. Does that not, in fact, sound like your ego? Child, I am love. That is what I am, and that is what I do. I love, and I love you, and that means that I love even your ego. But since you have asked, here is what I would have you know today about it. Your ego is innocent and profoundly lovable. At the bottom of it all, at the end of every messy story, when your ego has exhausted itself once more, fighting for its life and trying to keep itself relevant, and shadowboxing against itself and taking punches at everyone else, here is what remains true. Your ego is innocent. It is young. It is lovable. It doesn't know better. Not even when it tells you that you should have known better, or turns against itself in violence, or seethes in indignation at things, everything which it cannot even understand. It is young and it is a wild thing, a squirrel trapped in a shoebox pretending it knows how to read. Sweetheart, I will answer your question with a question of my own. Can you surrender to your own innocence? Feel how that question melts anxiety the way a nice cup of tea dissolves a sugar cube. This is what I do, dear little squirmy one, who wants to understand all things. I dissolve all the young and confused and self-centered and outraged parts of you like sugar into me. Into me you come every time you call my name. What is your ego? Something that love disrupts, interrupts, dissolves, and absorbs. Something I love into silence and serenity because I am love. Because I am silence and serenity. Now close this notebook for a moment and sit with me. Let's have some tea.
Hi. I'm Alex, and like Logan said today, we're talking about rest, which is so funny because anyone who knows me tells me that I need to rest more often. Quite frequently, that I am told that actually. So before I actually get into the nitty-gritty of like looking at the Bible verse, which we're going to be in 1 Kings 19 eventually. I have some rambling to do before we get there. So just as a quick introduction to the idea of the concept of rest and why it's important. So a couple weeks ago, after thoroughly destroying my body by attempting a boxing class, yeah, it was, I couldn't go upstairs, it was bad. I came across this story of the first marathon runner, and for some reason I was under the impression that his name was Marathon. That is not the case. His name was Philippides, I think. I'm a Hebrew girly, I don't know how to say Greek. But basically, the long and short of the story of the first marathon was basically the Persians invaded ancient Greece, and they started fighting near the city of Marathon, and the Athenians from the city of Athens and the people of Marathon, started fighting and all of that. And then they sent their Athenian messenger, Philippides, to run to Sparta to get help. The problem was that Sparta was 125 miles away. So Philippides ran 125 miles in 2 days to Sparta, and then delivered the message, ran 125 miles back to Athens, and then from Athens ran to Marathon, where the battle was still happening, gets there, finds out that the battle is over and that they won, runs 25 miles back to Athens to deliver the news that, hey, we won, and then promptly dies. Thank you, Harper. And I mention this because if you look at any sort of marathon today, it's a lot less common for people to die of exhaustion after running one.
This guy went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth.
Right. It's usually because we're not doing 250 miles as a warm-up in like a week, right? Like people who run marathons, like they train, they hydrate, they make sure that they're well rested before attempting one. And I think if we treated marathons like we treated any other area of our lives, it would be a lot more common for people to collapse of exhaustion, because we're not always the best at taking care of ourselves, especially when there's like a lot of pressure involved. With the world being the world and being as super messed up as it is, it's easy to fall into that Philippides mindset of running 300 miles in a week because it feels like the world is ending. Which really is, I think, kind of the question I wanted to ask today, which is, excuse me, how the hell are we supposed to rest when it feels like the world is collapsing around us? So, if you'll turn in your Bibles with me to 1 Kings 19. Okay. I'm going to read it for you guys anyway, so you don't have to go there. But essentially, I'm going to read verses 1 through 10. I'm going to give you the lowdown on what happens there, and then we're going to skip over a little middle part because there's a lot theologically just going on in this one chapter, and I do have a time limit. So, I'll start with 1 through 10. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, "So may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." Then he was afraid. He got up and fled for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah. He left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a solitary broom tree. He asked that he might die. "It is enough now, O Lord. Take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down under the broom tree and fell asleep. Suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, "Get up and eat." He looked, and there at his head was a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came a second time, touched him, and said, "Get up and eat, otherwise the journey will be too much for you." He got up and ate and drank. Then he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. At that place he came to a cave and spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." So there's a lot going on there. There's a lot we need to unpack. Just historically, I'll give you guys some background. So Elijah was a prophet in the northern kingdom of Israel. This was after the time where Israel and Judah had split into two different countries. Judah was the southern kingdom, and their monarchy was led by descendants of David. Israel, where Elijah was the northern kingdom and was led by descendants of Jeroboam, who did the split. It's this whole thing. So King Ahab is one of 20 kings that we get mentioned in the book of 1st and 2nd Kings. And Israel, unlike Judah had like maybe 8 good kings. Israel had no good kings. They all sucked. They were all terrible. They all were horrible people who led the country just drove it into the ground. So King Ahab was one of these. He married Jezebel, who was a Canaanite, and together they promoted the worship of Baal, which sounds funny. It's spelled Baal, It's not just a giant sphere that they're worshiping. Thank you, guys. Thank you for laughing. So Ahab was just, how do I put this? He was an asshole who, and because this is a narrative account and not necessarily a historical account, we're basically not told the fullness of the extent of the horrible things that he did to people. But just an example was he saw a vineyard that he liked, and so he murdered the person who owned it so he could have it. And again, that's just what we know from what the narrative tells us. And Jezebel was his wife, who was partially, if not wholly, responsible for Ahab's conversion. Again, like the idolatry led to a whole lot of injustice that was perpetrated. The Israelites were not doing well, basically. So right before this chapter, Elijah, again, one of the most prolific prophets of the Old Testament possibly ever, he did a lot of cool stuff, and a lot of the really big miracles were under Elijah, right? And so he's coming from, like in this chapter, he's coming from basically kicking butt at Mount Carmel, because he basically challenges 450 prophets to essentially what is a god-off. He's like, hey, all 450 of you, like, will do massive sacrifices, and you will like lay it on the altar, and like you won't light the fire, and I won't light the fire either, and then we'll ask our gods to light the fire for us, and whoever actually gets the fire wins, and their God is real. So
This is like some ancient
yeah, it was very dramatic. Like Elijah was certainly like he was kind of dramatic, and we love that for him. But naturally, when the 450 prophets are like, nothing happens. And then when Yahweh, good Lord, when Elijah calls out Yahweh, he actually goes the extra mile and soaks the wood in water first, like so much water that he like had to dig a pit around the altar so that it could fill up. And then like, there's fire from heaven, and it's really cool, and there's a crowd of witnesses around, and the witnesses are like, wow, Yahweh, and then they chase the 450 prophets around, and they direct it towards Elijah, and Elijah kills them all. Classic Old Testament shenanigans. And King Ahab was a witness to this, like one of the biggest miracles that we find in the Old Testament, obviously other than the Exodus and all that junk. Not junk, but you know what I mean. And so Elijah, like Ahab goes, he's probably going to like a palace, or they have multiple palaces, like a winter palace that he shared with Jezebel, and Ahab kind of Elijah follows Ahab at a distance to maybe see what Ahab does, because again, that's a huge thing that just got, like, huge. And instead of maybe receiving a historic announcement that they're turning away from idolatry and going back to Yahweh, Elijah is instead met with violence and loneliness. So naturally, he books it out of there, and he travels 25 miles, much like another historical figure I might have mentioned today, to Beersheba, which is all the way in the southern kingdom, so he's politically out of Jezebel's range, unless they want to start a war with Judah. And then he goes even further. He's already lonely, but he runs into the desert and leaves his servant behind, so he isolates himself even further. So at this point, when he lies down and he's like, God, just let me die, he's probably exhausted in every possible way. He's physically exhausted because, as we've already established, running a marathon is no joke, even in modern times, so to do it in the ancient world with probably very little supplies under your belt was not fun, even if you're not doing 250 miles beforehand. And emotionally, he's exhausted. Mentally, he's exhausted, isolated, and alone. And the first time I read this, it kind of reminded me of how, like, pack animals, when they're sick or injured, will just run off and find an isolated spot so they can die alone. And that's really what Elijah does. He's very depressed and suicidal, and everything that he worked for at this point seemed to be falling completely apart. Like again, there's that whole Mount Carmel thing. And it's also worth mentioning that when Jezebel writes this letter and sends the messenger, Ahab was probably in the room because he just told her about what happened. So when Jezebel sends a messenger to threaten him, Ahab does nothing, despite seeing all of this cool stuff that, fire from heaven, and yet he still does nothing. He's apathetic at best and malicious at worst. So it doesn't look good. Even with that, it wasn't enough. And so Elijah asks to die, right? He says he's no better than his ancestors. And also, quick side note, ancestors here could be a reference to genetic bloodline because that was very important in the ancient world. Excuse me. But it also could be a reference to prophetic predecessors. So there's this really weird trend that God's prophets do where they're like, hey God, it's me, I've had enough, please let me die. Yeah, it happens a lot, actually. Jonah does it in the book of Jonah. His situation is a lot different. And most notably, Moses actually does it too. And I say notably because there's a lot of narrative similarities between Moses and Elijah. They both run into the desert, different circumstances, but same desert. Mount Horeb was another name for Mount Sinai. So we're going same desert, same mountain, a lot of dramatics, a lot of miracles that happen. But if you look at, and you don't have to pull it up, but if you look at Numbers 11, I think 14, Moses gets fed up with all of these literal starving Israelites, although they weren't called Israelites back then. And he basically shouts up at God, and he's like, I am not able to carry all these people. They are too heavy for me. He's done. And if you look back at verse 4 of this 1 Kings passage, Elisha says, it is enough. It's too much. It's too heavy. I can't do it all. He's done. And he wouldn't make a request like that of literally a very powerful God unless he didn't, he wouldn't make it frivolously. He wouldn't make it unless he meant to say that. He probably felt like a failure. He was exhausted. Everything that he'd been asked to do, none of it was enough. He felt like he was carrying everything on his shoulders, and when you think of it like that, I can't imagine being that isolated and alone and just absolutely crushed by everything. Yeah. But then we have a messenger show up, and messenger and angel, interchangeable in Hebrew. But at this point, it's worth noting that Elijah, as soon as he has that whole thing where he's like, let me die, he probably collapses from exhaustion. He takes a nap, he falls asleep, but it's very likely that he just straight up collapsed from exhaustion. And so when the angel appears, it's not with a rebuke. The angel doesn't go, what are you doing? We have stuff we need to do. You're running away from the place where you're supposed to be located. The angel instead suddenly appears, and it makes sense that it's suddenly at first because when you collapse from exhaustion, that's a very precarious medical thing that's going on. And so instead of rebuking him, the angel feeds him, gives him food and water, and then it lets him take a nap. The word suddenly doesn't appear again the second time. There's no sense of urgency in the Hebrew. And so it's very likely that the angel, after feeding him and giving him water, just lets him sleep because he needs it, right? He needs physical restoration. Oh God, that sounds so evangelical. Oh. And again, there's no rebuke, there's no sense of pull yourself up by your bootstraps and let's get back to work. He just makes sure that Elijah is physically taken care of and rested as far as he can be rested physically. But then we see that this whole exhaustion state it's more than physical exhaustion. He's emotionally and mentally exhausted as well. And so, quick caveat here. I am gonna dump on evangelicalism because that's my thing. Evangelicalism would probably tell us, I think I've heard this preached on before, that the main problem here, the reason Elijah feels so exhausted and weak and just totally unable to do anything, they would tell us that it's because Elijah stopped relying on God. which I don't think is true, because Elijah does cry out to God, and he does it very honestly, and he doesn't mince words. He's yelling at God, basically, to just let him die, right? If you're stopping relying on God, it doesn't make sense to think of it through that lens. The problem is that even though Elijah is, again, one of the most famous prophets ever, he's doing all of these awesome miracles. He was very close to hopefully restoring, Yahweh's with Israel. It still wasn't enough. And he still hit his limit because he's still very human. Like, he's awesome and cool and he did all this cool stuff, but he's still just a guy, And he got tired and he just couldn't do it anymore, right? Or at least he couldn't do it by himself, right? And there's no shame in that. And God, again, there's no rebuke. God doesn't tell him that he couldn't be exhausted or tired or that he had to just turn around and go right back where he came from, right? God doesn't demand that we become perpetual motion machines. When we're exhausted, we rest. When we're tired, tired, same difference. When we're hungry, we eat. When we're thirsty, we drink. There are times to serve others, and there are times to let ourselves be served, and in this passage, we find the latter here, right? And I think a lot of the times, we tend to beat ourselves up for resting, myself included, myself majorly included. We think that if we don't keep going or chugging along, then everything will fall apart. And when we think like that, and we do hit our limit, it does feel like the end of the world because we've been working ourselves to the bone, right? But the world doesn't end when we stop to take care of ourselves. Elijah was able to take it out, eat, drink, all of that. And then later, he finds out that there are others out there too. So I'm going to go back to 1 Kings. Sorry, a lot of flip-flopping here. And I'm going to skip over a lot of the stuff in the middle. It's very theologically, there's so much going on there, and I don't have time to unpack it all. But basically, Elijah goes to this cave in Mount Sinai, there's thunder and lightning, and he's trying to listen for the Lord, and then he hears it in silence, right? So, starting at verse 13, when Elisha heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elisha?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." Then the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael as king over Aram, and you shall anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king over Israel, and you shall anoint Elijah, son of Shaphat of Abel-Mecholah, as prophet in your place. Whoever escapes from the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall kill, and whoever escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elisha shall kill. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." 7,000 is, kind of a lot, right? And so in this part here, God shows Elijah that he's not alone. I think part of, if not the major reason why Elijah just felt so absolutely exhausted and crushed and alone and just overwhelmed was because he was kind of a solo prophet at this point in time. He was doing a lot of this stuff by himself. And even though he did have a powerful God on his side, he's still human. And we already saw that his physical needs obviously were not being met or taken care of. So God shows him that he doesn't have to shoulder the burdens of an entire nation on his shoulder alone. Can you imagine telling God that you're completely alone, and then God's like, hey girlie, there's actually 7,000 people. That's 7 Asbury's? I should know how many people are at my university.
What? There are people like me?
There's 2,000.
2,000? Oh. Dang. That's, that's 3.5 Asbury's? I can't do math. Okay. That did slip out, I'm sorry. So again, this whole mindset of everything relies on me, or if we let ourselves fall into, if I don't keep working or doing my homework or going at 110%, then everything will get worse. When we fall into that, it becomes extremely easy to exhaust ourselves. And like a lot of the time, we might not even realize that we're doing it. Myself, I often, I think I realized this last week, every couple of weeks I just find myself completely exhausted in pretty much every sense of the term. And it's just, like I'm an Enneagram 2, right? And if you guys know anything about Enneagram 2s, you know that we tend to prioritize the needs of everyone else over ourselves, often to our own detriment. And I find it very easy, personally, to fall into that mindset of, if I'm not emotionally and physically available at all times, then everything will fall apart and something horrible will happen and it will be my fault. And it's an illogical belief to have, but it's still there, right? And I realized this last week that I've been kind of doing that for years, right? Just that constant cycle of going and then collapse, and then going and then collapse, and again and again and again and again. And it's really exhausting. It's horrible, I hate it. Every so often I have to put a post-it note on my door that says, please leave me alone, I'm recharging, or something to that effect. And part of why I fall into that, and part of why Elijah, I guess, falls into that, is because when I do that, I'm not taking care of my physical and emotional and mental needs. And I'm not acknowledging that there are other people around me who not only can help deal with any emergencies that pop up, but who can also help support me and the things that I need, right? I don't have to be a perpetual motion machine. I don't have to constantly serve other people. I can let myself be served too. And I think that's the lesson really that we can pull from this. The Old Testament is really tricky, especially with all of the, death and murder and 450 prophets that got, right? But I think the thing that we can pull from this is that idea of letting ourselves rest and letting ourselves be served by the people around us, right? Not in like a butler way, just in a like, hey guys, I need help way, right? And again, the world today is pretty messed up. Modern day Israel is committing genocide in Palestine. We still have the Ukrainian war going on. And in the US, we have politicians who are supporting said genocide and all of these other things, taking away rights from minorities. And that's even before we get to a lot of the issues in our everyday lives. So I want to return to that question of how do we rest, or what do we do when the world is falling apart around us? How can we go on when we're exhausted and scared and lonely? And the answer, I think, that we've found is that we don't. Or more specifically, we don't force ourselves to continue. We don't turn around and get right back to it when we're clearly exhausted. If Elijah had forced himself to keep going, we'd never heard from him again. And he would have died from exhaustion, like Philippians, who literally ran 300 miles to death because he thought the world was ending, and it ended up being fine, right? Punishing ourselves when the world is already punishing us only leads to broken bones, and God does not begrudge us the chance to rest. And I think, real quick, as I finish here, I think something that helps me when I'm feeling exhausted is taking some me time is always helpful, right? Like reading a book is good for rest, even if I have things I need to be working on, just to step away for a little bit. And also recognizing there are people in your life who you can turn to and who you can rely on. And I don't just mean therapists, although I love therapy. Therapy is really good. But the people around you can also just be a good support system if you let yourself be supported. And also, just as a quick side note, the suicide prevention hotline is now, I think, 988. But the bottom line is that God wants you to nap and eat some food, and it's not a weakness to rely on the other people around you. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Alex. As another person who's quite terrible at rest, it's such a great perspective to think about because life never stops going. We're going to transition to a time at the table. So if you want to go get some goldfish and some juice and be back here, that'd be great. I truly believe that people are sacred and that God, whatever they look like, sees sacredness in each of us as much as we try to see sacredness in God. And so we have a really neat opportunity to celebrate sacredness as we eat and as we drink. So let's do that together. So God, who I currently call Jesus, would you help us to rest as it rains outside and as times are dreary and hard and as so much troublesome things happen in the world? Would you help us just to breathe in and breathe out a restful mindset? Help us to be present and to be mindful of what's in front of us and not only just thinking ahead. And thank you for this sacred time and this sacred moment. Thank you for Alex and the wisdom that she brought us today. And would you meet us just where we are? Because I hope you're sacred too. Amen. So we're just going to end this time with the benediction. It says, "Go in courage to lie down, in sacred defiance of a world that would rather your own body than protect it. May you say no, and I'm leaving, and I'm not saving this. Your boundaries never predicated on apology. In a time of frenzied activity, may you choose stillness, and in this breath, and this silence, and